what's happening today in Afghanistan is not something that women in Afghanistan have done anything to bring it. They were not part of making that decision to bring the Taliban in power. They were not the first time, they were not this time. But they are living the consequences of what happened, the consequence of decision they did not make, and the consequence of what happened. Their rights were negotiated. So now there is a responsibility, and women are fighting themselves in Afghanistan. They need support. They need help from outside. They need the countries to listen to them, and not so much in terms of how they can negotiate with the Taliban.
Hello and welcome to Rights and Wrongs, a podcast by Human Rights Watch. I'm Birgit Schwarz. 2 years ago, the Taliban made a stunning return to power in Afghanistan. Their takeover followed a hasty retreat by US allied forces. Since then, the country has become one of the most repressive for women and girls worldwide. This echoes what happened during their first time in power in the late 90s. Then the Taliban justified their repression of girls and women with a rigid militant interpretation of Islam. Sadly, today, the same is happening. Afghan girls can no longer get an education beyond primary schools, and women are banned from most jobs and even public spaces. Disobedience is risky, and yet many courageous Afghan women are raising their voices and fighting for their rights. Zahra Nader is the editor-in-chief of the Zan Times, an news source in exile run by women. Zan Times reports on human rights abuses and seeks to amplify the voices of women in Afghanistan. Welcome to the show, Zahra.
Thank you, Birgit. Appreciated the opportunity to be here and speak.
Fereshta Abbasi is a researcher in the Asia division at Human Rights Watch. Fereshta is also originally from Afghanistan. Welcome to Rights and Wrongs, Fereshta.
Thanks, Birgit.
Fereshta, let's start with you. You lived in Afghanistan actually during the time of the presence of the US and the Allied forces, which lasted for about 20 years. At the time, women could get an education and they could pursue a career, and you yourself actually benefited from this. You were able to get a BA from Herat University in the west of the country, and then managed to move on to do an MA in the UK. You actually, I think, were in the UK when the Taliban returned to power in August 2021. What were your thoughts and emotions when they did so?
Today, actually, marks the second anniversary of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. And I speak with a very heavy heart. It's a very difficult day for all Afghans. And I would like to take a moment and pay respect to those women inside Afghanistan who are still protesting and are still in the streets of Takhar, Ghazni, and Kabul. I think they're very brave. It's very brave of Afghan women that to still protest and try to raise their voice from inside Afghanistan under the Taliban control. Speaking of 15 August 2021, it's not an easy thing for me. It definitely reminds me all the trauma, all the anxiety that I had at the time. But let's go, a week before that. You mentioned that I studied in Herat, and the Taliban in 2021 very much followed the same direction and route that they had followed during their first takeover in the 90s. They took over Kandahar and then Mazar, and then it came to Herat before Kabul. And when they took over Herat, I was very hopeless. I think I was devastated by the time. Herat felt home. I knew that city. I studied there. I lived there. That's where I went to university. And I think when Herat collapsed, I was lost. I was confused. I didn't know what should I do. And I was in constant communication with my family and friends there. And we were all scared. And we didn't know what should we do. I think I was frozen. And I remember I couldn't sleep for a week. And then, it didn't last long. Then the Taliban took over Kabul and it was done. And I couldn't believe it. When I received a message from my sister, when she told me that President Ghani has skipped the country and the Taliban are at the presidential palace, I didn't believe it. I thought she's joking with me.
Yeah, let's just explain for our listeners. President Ghani was the then elected president of Afghanistan. Afghanistan actually did have an elected government at the time, and the Taliban takeover was very much negotiated by the U.S. Administration at that time, led by President Trump. Fereshta, you described you said you were frozen, you were stunned. This takeover also really put an end to your ambitions and your dreams, I believe. How and to what extent did it also affect other women that you know, maybe also your relatives?
I think on a personal note, it really changed my life. And I was planning to go back. I wanted to be at home. As a born refugee, for me, I was born as a refugee in Iran. And I mean, the situation of Afghan refugees in Iran is very evident for everyone. And we know that Iran is not bound by any international refugee documents when it comes to Afghan refugees. And I was denied of having access to education in Iran. When we returned to Afghanistan, it felt home. It was where no one could actually kick me out of a classroom. And that's how I went to school and then went to Herat University to do my bachelor's in law. And I was very much planning and committed to go back to Afghanistan. When the Taliban took over, I couldn't believe that Afghanistan is not safe for me anymore. And I think it was the case for some of my friends who were out and we were studying. I came to the UK to do my master's and go back and work for that country. I still believe that in all over the world, if there is one place that really needs me to be there and really needs me to work for it, it's definitely Afghanistan.
Zahra, your story is kind of the same, although it happened 20 years earlier when the Taliban took power for the first time. At that time, I was actually there. I was in Kandahar in the southeast of the country and basically reporting on what was happening there. Even women doctors at the time were banned from doing their jobs. There was nobody manning or no personnel for the clinics for women who sought help in their pregnancies, for example. Girls were no longer allowed to go to school. So very much the same happened. And you at the time also fled. You fled to Iran. And despite this, you managed to get, and against all the odds, you managed to get a PhD in the end. Education is extremely important to you, and you wanted to return, like Fereshta, you wanted to return to Afghanistan to improve women's lot over there. So sadly, as for Fereshta, the Taliban dashed that dream. What does it do to a country as a whole when its women lose their right to education?
Thank you, Birgit. Thank you, Birgit, for this question. I think my story is very similar to what Fereshta described here, that our fight very much began in our home. And that is true for many, many women in Afghanistan. Those who have the opportunity to go to school, they were dreaming of changing the country. They were dreaming of building the country that they deserve to live in, that their children, the next generation of Afghanistan deserve to live in. So we were trying our best. And I think your question about what it means for a country, I think our mothers, the generation who lived before us in the 1990s, the first Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, they very much knew, and also we knew what was happening. We were hearing the accounts of our mothers, we were reading about it, but we could not believe that it would be repeated in another generation of women in Afghanistan. We thought what happened in the 90s was history. But we got to know that history is being repeated again on us. As Fereshta described, Afghanistan was never a good country for women, even before the Taliban takeover. But there was opportunities that women like me and Fereshta could use this opportunity for change, for bringing aspiration to their society, for trying to do their best and play their role in contributing to the betterment of the society. And that started with education. When I moved to Iran, the first time the Taliban take over, I was also denied the right to education. Then what's happening today in Afghanistan is very, very traumatizing for me in a sense that I relived those trauma, that I was denied the right to education and what happened in the country.
Let's unpack a bit what's happening today in Afghanistan, because we haven't done that yet. So, Fereshta, world leaders, I mean, the Taliban, when they seized power in 2021, in fact, on August 17, they gave their first press conference and claimed that things would be different this time, that they would respect women's rights. World leaders chose to believe this. You did not. Why not? And can you now describe also how the conditions for Afghan women have gradually worsened over the last 2 years again?
The Taliban takeover for Afghan women had a clear message that we will be pushed back to our houses. And as Zahra said that, we knew how the Taliban ruled the country during their first takeover for 5 years. And it was a dark moment for Afghan women. We knew what we were facing. And over the past 24 months, the Taliban have proved that. They have clearly shown that they are not serious about respecting or protecting human rights, especially the rights of women. More than 80% of their written decrees and rules are restrictive for women. In 2023, Afghanistan remains the only country where women and girls do not have access to secondary and higher education. Women do not have the right to most employment. They do not have the right to freedom of movement. They need to be accompanied by a mahram, which is a male blood-related family member, and no right to protest, no right to assembly. And that's why I say that women who are still protesting are very brave. We've documented the abusive conditions of the release of the very few female protesters that started protesting in the streets of Kabul right after the Taliban takeover, as well as how the Taliban treated them during the detention. They have been physically tortured. They have been mentally tortured. Their family members were brought into that. So I think the situation in Afghanistan for women has changed so much. I was speaking to a friend yesterday that is still in Kabul and is living in hiding because she used to be a women's rights activist. She used to be a prominent women's rights activist. She's deleted all her public profile, her Twitter account, her Facebook account, because she doesn't want anyone to know about her identity and where she's living now. And she told me that she doesn't believe that her life has changed so much in 24 months. She used to be financially independent. Now she doesn't have a job. She wanted to do her master's. She was applying for universities to go and do her master's. Everything is gone. There was nothing for her left.
There are many, many, many women like this, and we'll come to the women protesters just now because Zahra is working on a documentary about those. You're listening to Rights and Wrongs, a weekly podcast by Human Rights Watch. I'm speaking to two Afghan women, Zahra Nader and Fereshta Abbasi, about the continuous repression of women in Afghanistan and how this affects the country as a whole. Zahra, education gives women self-confidence, as we've just heard, and it opens up career opportunities. But in today's Afghanistan, even beauty salons have recently been shuttered. It was the first ban imposed on women working in the private sector. How has this ban made women's daily lives even more difficult?
When the Taliban closed other venues for women, they had one big argument, and it was because of our religion. We don't want women to be interacting with men. So we are slashing their work opportunity. We are not allowing them to go out. We are not allowing them to work in an office environment. That's why they ban women from working in public sectors, banning women from working in NGOs, and even the United Nations offices in Afghanistan. That's been sort of accommodated by international community. They condemn it. They said it was concerning, but nothing really happened to prevent it. So we are reaching a point that the Taliban are banning the very, very narrow opportunities that left for women to feed themselves. And those were places that women were interacting with women. Like the beauty salons, no one were entering there. So it was women working with women. The only opportunities that women could earn their living was there, and the Taliban banned it. So it's a clear message that they do not want women to exist as a part of a social society where they would be able to support themselves, support their families. And we are talking about a country that has a large amount of women who do not have a male member in their family because their husband, their brother, most of them have been killed or affected by the 4 decades of war in Afghanistan. how do these women can live in a society where cannot eat, where they cannot go out and be visible, and then they do not have any man to support them. That's one point. And then when we are thinking about the country in crisis, where 95% of the society do not have anything to eat, how those women can earn their living, and then the very few women who were able to deliver aid to these millions of affected women, their work has been banned. So we are seeing ban of humanitarian aid reaching this vulnerable population, as well as the crisis that's ongoing and getting even worse by the day. And then also we have the Taliban's continuous clampdown and even closing the very limited venues of work opportunity that was left for women.
This is not only about freedom, about the right to assemble, about the right to speak up and the right to work. It's really a matter of survival that women cannot work. And the fact that they can no longer feed their families, that even they see their children and babies starving, a lot of them dying, has led to quite a lot of depression amongst women in Afghanistan. So even before the Taliban, Fereshta, returned to power, there was almost no mental health infrastructure in Afghanistan. But you've recently been looking into the state of the country's health system. So in terms of mental health care, which is really, really vital right now, what resources, if any, are available for women?
I actually have been traveling to do a report. I was doing a research for Human Rights Watch about the challenges that women with disabilities face in Afghanistan. And that's one of the reports that I was traveling in different provinces to get a sense of up to what extent there are mental health resources available. And the findings of the report says that there isn't much. And it's before the takeover, the Taliban takeover. And now it's worse. I have been speaking to organizations and people on the ground for the past few months to get a sense of access to healthcare services, especially for women in Kabul and other provinces of Afghanistan. And unfortunately, it's because of the economic crisis that is happening there, it impacts every other aspect of your life. So, in some of the provinces of Afghanistan, for example, the Taliban have instructed and have said that only a female doctor can see a female patient, which is not something that is available in every village. And that means that if there isn't a female patient, female doctor, and if you need to see a doctor, you need to you basically either can't or you need to travel a long distance to go to a center of city to see a female doctor. And this is about very basic healthcare services that you need. And as you said, and sometimes it's about women who wants to deliver babies. It's really about a matter of life and death. When it comes to mental health services, there isn't much. There isn't. I mean, it's very little support that is there. And it's also imaginable that if you're a woman who used to be financially independent, who used to be, yourself, who used to be part of the whole process, be a very active and integral part of the Afghanistan society, and now you're pushed back to your house, of course you're depressed. Of course you have anxiety. And when you know that there is a dark future, you're not optimist about the future, all of these, I think it puts a lot of pressure on women, and there was no support available, unfortunately.
I wanted to add to what already Fereshta said about the non-existence of very infrastructures for mental health in Afghanistan. We recently worked on a story where we talked and looked, trying to get an access to data about how many women are trying to kill themselves as they see no hope. We were able to find any statistics where we gathered from 11 provinces. And what we are seeing is a jump in the number of women trying to kill themselves. And when we talked to mental health workers, officials, there was two disturbing patterns. One is that they told us that 90% of their patients that they're seeing are women, and mostly educated women who lost their rights to education, lost their rights to work. They used to work, they used to go to universities. Now they are feeling the pressure a lot, and that affected their mental health. So, and beside that, they told us that the infrastructure is not ready for this amount of mental health crisis that is hitting the country. For instance, in Herat, I think Fereshta might know this as well, there is a mental health ward. That mental health ward has only 25 beds. And that 25 beds meant for millions of people who are living in 4 provinces. So you can imagine the amount of crises that are happening, the mental health, and the lack of infrastructures when there is no place they could go and actually seek help. And this, we consider that in a country that doesn't have a deep understanding of what mental health could do to you. Because most of the time, the culture is not in a way that would inform you about mental health and that you need to take care of yourself. And catastrophe is happening right now in this particular situation.
So, but despite this backdrop of isolation, repression, and depression, many Afghan women keep fighting for their rights. Zahra, you are actually working on a documentary about women protesters, as I mentioned earlier. What did they tell you is motivating them to speak out despite the risks?
We are working in a video story where we are trying to tell the story of women who are resisting in Afghanistan, and that resistance come in different forms. One of them, as we see, was the protests that they come on the streets. But as the Taliban have banned the ability for women to come and protest and ask for their rights, they are being beaten, they're being arrested, kidnapped, and even killed for their participation in street protests in Afghanistan. And we have documented that in our work. But what are their work? So when they are banned from coming to the streets, which they still do, that needs a lot of courage to go and face the Taliban on the streets where what's the cost. And that's a very huge cost that they're paying. And then there's other venues that they do protest, that they do resist. One of those venues is that women come indoors. They gather, they talk, they raise their voice, and they ask the world to listen to them. And most of the time, their request is to not recognize the Taliban, to pressure the Taliban to accept women's rights, to accept human rights in Afghanistan. Some of the time they sing, you're not able to see their faces. They wear burqas. I have been privileged to know 2 sisters who are doing this from their own home. They're sitting inside and they're singing, and their singing is a way of resistance. We have spoken to people who do play theaters in their house in a way to send a message that what's happening to them and what they need to be doing. And they're asking the world for help. We do speak to women who are running secret schools and preparing themselves for a life beyond the Taliban regime, because in the Taliban regime, we understood that there is no school, there is no hope for the future, and they know it better. But they know they cannot lose hope. They have to fight back, and they are fighting back. And their fighting back coming to different forms, and the situation is getting even worse, but they have not lost hope. They'll continue to fight still to this day.
And they're fighting back also using online spaces, right, which are not yet censored in Afghanistan, fortunately. Yeah, so this testifies to this amazing resilience of Afghan women. And it also testifies, I think, to the fact what Fereshta mentioned earlier. They are no longer the same women that they were before the first takeover of the Taliban. These are educated women. They don't want to lose what they had gained over the last 20 years. Fereshta, the Taliban regime certainly isn't the only regime that suppresses the rights of women, but their decrees go well beyond other Islamic governments' attempts to control women. Why do you think they feel so threatened by women's participation in society?
I think they're scared of independent, strong women. And this is something that, it might be very stereotyped, but most men are scared of strong, independent women. A woman who's educated, she would decide for herself. She wouldn't let anyone to control her. She will stand for her rights. And that's what the Taliban cannot get along with. That's what the Taliban don't understand. They can't let women to do that in Afghanistan. And that's why they're trying to control them by banning them from education. But I think what they've missed is the fact that they think that by pushing back to women to the houses, then they can control it that way, which is not the case. I have said this before, and I want to repeat it again, that for me, the resistance in Afghanistan is that 12 years old girl in a village of Helmand who is attending an underground school, she knows how the world looks. She has seen a different world, and she knows that, and she has hope, and that's the picture that she's fighting for. That's the imagination that she wants to live in. That's the life that she deserves. And Afghan women are fighting for that.
Yeah, and at this day and age, it is really, really difficult to isolate a country unless you cut it off completely from any kind of online communication, for example. You are listening to Rights and Wrongs, a weekly podcast by Human Rights Watch. I'm joined by Afghan journalist Zahra Nader and Human Rights Watch's Fereshta Abbasi. We're discussing the worsening crisis in Afghanistan and the forms of resistance women have developed in response to the Taliban's repression. So, Fereshta, so far, not a single country in the world has formally recognized the Taliban's rule. So besides showing the regime the cold shoulder, what other responses do you seek from the international community, from donors, and also from UN institutions to help the women of Afghanistan?
I think Afghanistan is a collective failure, and the countries who are engaged in Afghanistan in the past 20 years have a responsibility to make sure that they support the people of Afghanistan. And there are many ways to fulfill this. First of all, there is a humanitarian crisis ongoing, which is hitting women and girls. Very harder than anyone else because they're the most vulnerable community inside Afghanistan right now. Trying to make sure that the donor communities are finding ways to mitigate the humanitarian crisis and to make sure that they're distributing the aid to women and girls inside Afghanistan in a way that does not reinforce the Taliban's repressive policies are, I think, one of the very important things that donor communities need to do. Beside that, listen to what women on the streets of Afghanistan want and say. It's very important to listen to the concerns of Afghans and support that voice and amplify their voices. We want the world to stand with women in Afghanistan. If women in Afghanistan haven't given up yet, if they can find the hope to fight and go to streets, we should fight. We should have the hope and find ways to support them. And I think one of the other things that 2 years after the Taliban takeover, I would like to say is that open, safe, legal pathways for Afghan women who are at risk and cannot live inside Afghanistan to be resettled and to find safety. In the first few months after the Taliban takeover, we saw different countries, including US, UK, Canada, Germany, that have promised that they will resettle women at risk. And 2 years later, we see thousands of these people who are at risk in third countries, in Pakistan, Turkey, Iran, UAE,
and refugee camps without any ways out.
Yes. Yeah.
You said something interesting. You said, listen to what Afghan women want. Zahra, there are sort of growing voices claiming that the Taliban are using women's rights as a bargaining chip, basically saying, if you recognize us, we'll improve women's situation. Would that mean listening to women's voices? And would that actually improve the women's situation in Afghanistan?
Thank you for that question, because it's very, very important for us to judge the Taliban by their action, not by what they are saying or promising, because we have seen that there is no trust on what they are saying, their words. They continue to show us, prove us that they are lying about what they are saying. And we should have a clear understanding who the Taliban are and what they want. And they have shown us. They have shown us in the first time they took over Afghanistan, they've shown how they want to treat women in the country that they're controlling. They have shown us again now, 20 years later, we are seeing the same Taliban doing even worse than what they did in the 90s. And they continue to clamp down on women's rights. So I think there is no negotiation in terms of maybe the Taliban is misunderstanding or the Taliban is using women's rights to, as a bargaining chip. They might be using it, but we have to be very clear. what is this negotiation? What would be the outcome of any engagement, any negotiation with the Taliban? Because we know who they are, how they treat women, and that is the statement. So now the world should take a collective action toward pressuring the Taliban, who they know that by now. How can we reverse these policies? How can we pressure the Taliban? And how can we listen to the women in Afghanistan who are saying that we have nothing to do with the Taliban, who are continuously clapping down, who do not recognize as human beings? That's the voices they are raising, and they are asking that the Taliban should not be negotiated. There should be no recognition of the Taliban, and there should not be any negotiation that might legitimize the Taliban, that might normalize the Taliban. That is part of what they are demanding. Women in Afghanistan are demanding right now.
Zahra, last question. I mean, as we've heard, women in Afghanistan are making their voices heard loud and clear that they do not want this regime, that they do want education, that they are confident, and that they want career opportunities. Is there a final image of hope you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I want us to think that we are speaking about the only country on the planet that denies women the very basic human rights, like rights to education, rights to be able to work, and rights to freedom of movement. That is banned for women in Afghanistan. It is now 2 years that millions of women, we can say an estimated 20 million women in Afghanistan, wake up and see no hope, no purpose. As long as the Taliban are in power, there's no hope for them. But they refuse to accept that there's going to be no change. They're fighting, even though it's hard for them to see light at the end of the tunnel. They are resisting. They are fighting. And I think that gives me hope. That gives Fereshta hope. And anybody else that are trying to do something to support their voices, we are doing this because they have not given up. They are fighting. And as Fereshta said, we need to be supporting them. The people, the countries who are involved in Afghanistan, they have a responsibility to support women's rights, to support human rights in Afghanistan. Because what's happening today in Afghanistan is not something that women in Afghanistan have done anything to bring it. They were not part of making that decision to bring the Taliban in power. They were not the first time, they were not this time. But they are living the consequences of what happened, the consequence of decision they did not make, and the consequence of what happened. Their rights were negotiated. So now there is a responsibility, and women are fighting themselves in Afghanistan. They need support. They need help from outside. They need the countries to listen to them, and not so much in terms of how they can negotiate with the Taliban.
Yeah, and from what you described before, like women still singing in a country where singing and music is forbidden, women inviting teachers to their houses, women organizing underground schools. All of this basically talks to the fact that women in Afghanistan are definitely preparing for a life beyond the Taliban.
Exactly.
Thank you both so very much for sharing your memories, your experiences, your pain, also some of your hopes for Afghanistan. Thank you for making the time, Zahra, and thank you for being on the show, Fereshta.
Thank you for having us here.
Thanks so much, Birgit, for doing the all work. Yeah, I'm so honored actually to share the panel with Zahra. Thanks so much, Zahra, for doing this with us.
Thank you, Kristen. That was very nice.
More of Human Rights Watch's work on Afghanistan can be found in the description to this episode. You've been listening to Rights and Wrongs, a podcast by Human Rights Watch. Our producers are Christina Varganova, Blair Palmer, and Devin Schwartz. Our co-producer and engineer is Kosi Okpuli. I'm Birgit Schwartz. In next week's episode, we'll be discussing brand new Human Rights Watch research on the killing of hundreds of mostly Ethiopian migrants at the Saudi-Yemeni border. Join us again then. Goodbye for now.